Latinos are now the largest ethnic group in California, and the San Joaquin Valley is home to 14% of the state's adult Latino population. As a result, how well Latinos are faring economically has a big impact on how well California and the Valley are doing economically. Our guest is Mindy Romero from the USC Price School of Public Policy, who recently conducted an in-depth analysis of the economic state of Latinos in California. What were her findings?
BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us. Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. While Latino is an emerging political force in California and the Valley, they're generally well less off economically than the state's population as a whole. So what are the causes and what are some of the prescriptions to improve the economic well-being, including making a stronger Latino middle class? Our guest is Mindy Romero with the USC Price School of Public Policy, recently took an in-depth analysis, researched those issues, and is here to share her findings. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me again.
So let's talk about California Latinos. How are they generally, where do they fall on the income scale?
They fall low on the income scale overall. So if we look at the most recent numbers around median household income in California, for the total population, it's 71,000. For Latinos, it's 56,000. If you compare Latinos to the group that has the highest median household income, which is Asian Americans, that's 91,000.
Wow.
So
quite a bit more.
Quite a substantial $36,000 or so difference between those two groups alone. If we look even over the last decade since the recession, we've seen increases across the board, but what has remained are those disparities are quite significant. And the increases for Latinos have been smaller than they have been for whites as well as Asian Americans.
So they're not closing that gap?
No, the gap actually has been widening.
Okay, so let's talk a little about home ownership, which is a major part of someone's financial worth. Certainly for most Californians, it's also a problem that more and more Californians can't afford a home. So what is the impact on Latinos specifically?
Quite significant. So first, as you said, a major part of wealth, a major part of generational wealth, particularly for Latinos, is one of the key, sometimes the only pathway to achieve generational wealth. And home ownership rates are challenged in California, certainly. If we look at California Association of Realtors, they estimate that the typical Californian needs to make $111,000 to be able to buy the medium-priced home.
And you were saying that Latinos' average salary is $71,000.
No, $56,000.
Oh, sorry. Average salary in California is $71,000. Latinos is $56,000, right?
So if you do the math, exactly. So there's a gap between that $111,000 to buy that medium priced home, which is about $550,000 for everybody. But the gap is much wider for Latinos. It's literally.
And by the way, you're
half.
saying $550,000. That number has gone up in the last year. I think I was seeing somewhere it was getting close to $600,000.
Yeah, these numbers are 2017 to be able to compare what we have income-wise to.
But it's amazing though. That's a lot of money, and so you have to earn a lot, and they're not.
So Latinos are making half what they need to make as a household in California to be able to purchase a home, and that translated. If we look over at specifically home ownership rates themselves. Home ownership rates are much lower for Latinos across the board in every region in the state. Yeah,
one of the things I noticed from your report is you said that 80% of Latinos do not have enough household income to buy a medium-priced home in California. That's an amazing statistic. So you're talking about, your data also showed that a 20% difference between home ownership rates between Latinos and whites.
64 compared to 44.
Okay, so and then there's also a gender disparity as well within Latinos. Latino men have greater home ownership than Latino women, I believe?
Yes, okay. by several percentage points. So it's more of a challenge if you are a Latina to be able to purchase a home.
Okay, so but there is one bright spot, that's the San Joaquin Valley. It has among the highest rates of Latino home ownership. So what's driving those numbers, and how do those numbers compare to other areas of the state?
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on in the Central Valley. Not only are home ownership rates higher for Latinos in the Central Valley compared to Latinos elsewhere, or at least in many parts of the state, but also the gap, the disparity between the Latinos and whites, which is the group that has the highest home ownership rates, is smaller in the Central Valley. It's out of all the regions we examined, the 7 top regions, it has the second smallest disparity gap. What's happening is there's a lot of factors, but probably a principal factor is just that homes are less costly in the Central Valley, and the gap between income to that magic number you need typically on average to be able to purchase a home is smaller.
Yeah, and I think obviously the houses, I'm not sure exact numbers, but I'm sure they're quite a bit more expensive on the coast as it is opposed to the
Still
valley.
a challenge in the Central Valley,
Right.
but that gap there is smaller, and it's less of a challenge at least. And you're right, that's a bright spot.
Okay, so but overall though, your research shows that there's a lack of adequate housing, and it's particularly acute among California Latinos. And one thing you talk about is this housing burden cost. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so housing cost burden defined by HUD is simply when more than 30% of your household income is going towards your housing costs, whether it's mortgage and utilities or rent and utilities. Right. And so for the housing cost burden for the state is about 47% for everybody. For Latinos, it's much lower, close to 40%, about 40% or so. Even larger gap when you're looking at Asian Americans or whites. Mm-hmm. That's substantial. If you break it out by home ownership and renters, what's really striking is that there's still a pretty substantial housing cost burden for those that are, that have purchased a home that own a home. Right. And we often think about, as we just said, home ownership is the pathway to generational wealth. Right. It's the investment, the key investment that everybody makes. But just because you are able to afford a home and get into a home doesn't mean that you are able to purchase everything. It doesn't mean that you're set, right? We know that many Californians, many Latinos are struggling to be able to make those payments, or they can make those payments, but they're struggling to be able to purchase everything else that they need in their house to take care of their kids and their family. And then if you're a renter, it's much higher. It's about 64 or so % housing cost burden, which in and of itself
for Latinos, and more Latinos are renting than purchasing homes.
Exactly. So Latinos are the only group that has a majority renter. Mm-hmm. And so that's particularly challenging. And also it's challenging because if you think about being able to save up, one of the barriers to getting into a home, what we think of as a part of the middle class in California, to be able to save up if you're housing cost burden and you're having a hard time paying your rent or being able to pay.
There's no way you're
How are you going to be able to?
Sure.
Exactly.
Well, another key predictor of high income is the ability of the middle class to get an education. So the educational report card is what we're going to talk about next. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Mindy Romero, the head of the California Civic Engagement Project at USC's Price School of Public Policy, and the author of an in-depth report on the economic well-being of California Latinos. So, Mindy, let me ask you this. Education, huge issue. It's a key indicator for economic success. Let's start first talking about graduation rates, high school graduation rates. How do Latinos compare to the general population when it comes to graduation rates?
So there is a gap, as we've talked about already in a number of the other topics that we've covered today, but the gap is not as wide. So graduation rates for Latinos, 78%, that's just a few percentage points below the rate for the total population. We've seen improvement over the last decade or so, but the improvement is still small. The gap still remains, even though it is lower, even though it's a small, relatively small gap. It still translates into thousands and thousands of kids every year that are not participating. And then if we look at other measures around educational attainment, if we look at CSU, UC eligibility rates.
Before we get there, I'm going to ask you a question just because I do want to talk about educational reforms. You know, we have Common Core, we've got the local control funding formula. There's been some, just to kind of reinforce your point, there have been some educators that say, well, the achievement gap isn't closing fast enough. Yeah. And so one of the big issues is how long do you have to wait until, is a reasonable period of time to see if those educational reforms are actually making a difference. So just a kind of a footnote on that point, there's improvement, but some people are saying that the improvement maybe isn't fast enough. But let's talk about UC and CSU.
Yeah. And we should be impatient with it. And there's still a question about how much of that gap can we close with current policy and current programs and the factors that go into why we have disparities in not only high school graduation rates, but other measures around educational attainment are quite entrenched.
And those things are the measures of language proficiency or math proficiency. Mm-hmm. How do Latinos compare on those numbers?
So if we back up and we think about it in terms of a pipeline, right, to produce those graduation rates, college going rates, and so forth, Latinos actually fare really poorly. Young kids, so fourth grade students, if we look at standardized testing scores, which can be problematic in and of themselves, but still as a measure that, as the data that we do have, around math proficiency and language arts proficiency, Latinos are ranked last amongst the 4 major or largest population groups.
So when you're comparing against whites, Asians, African Americans?
Yeah, so only 28% of Latino 4th graders are math proficient. Only about 34% of Latino 4th graders are language arts proficient.
And just to compare that, because I was looking at your numbers, and you have 28% are math proficient, 71% of age compared to Asians.
So exactly.
Big
So
gap.
in here, not only are Latinos very low, but the gap between Latinos and whites, and particularly Asian Americans, is incredibly wide.
And the same is true.
Enormous.
The same is true about language proficiency as well. The same gap remains, both math and it's not
they're
just
both huge gaps, and it means that our kids are starting at really low rates, and those are key ages, key grades, right, that are predictors for whether somebody goes to college, whether they do well in college.
They say that you'll know by that grade, you're going to know if someone's going to be going to college or not. It's those early years are critically important.
And again, the gaps remain in terms of those eligibility rates, and also only 13% of Latinos 25 or older in California have a 4-year degree.
Yeah, I wanted to talk
higher.
about college attendance and graduation rates. One thing I found interesting in your report, you said the fewest UC and CSU eligible students are in the San Joaquin Valley, only 13%, compared to 45% for all California high school students. We also have, the Valley also has the lowest Latino college graduates, only 7% versus 13% of the statewide. So the Valley in particular is behind on those measures.
Yeah, and the disparities across groups are quite wide within the Valley. So just low and disparities are wide.
What are some of the factors that are driving, these educational results among Latinos?
Yeah, so many of the factors that produce poor educational outcomes, right, are related to factors around income, right, or predictors at least. So lower income itself, or families with a history of lower educational attainment, certainly predict usually kids that are going to have more of a challenge in terms of being able to.
If your parents didn't go to college, college is a pretty scary experience for you.
Exactly. Well, and also you don't have the support. The parents don't have just the information and the experience to be able to guide their kids through the process. That's quite understandable.
I remember when I was going to college, neither one of my parents went to college. My mom went with me to the orientation, and we were both looking at each other. She couldn't help me, I couldn't help her. We didn't know even what questions to ask.
Yeah, it can be a problem in many families regarding the race ethnicity, but Latinos are much more likely that a kid going through the process is much more likely to have parents that didn't have that experience, to not have a family network that had that experience.
And that makes a difference.
It makes a huge difference. And when we think also about, being able to afford those special programs that help you do better on SAT
on the standardized
scores,
exams, you don't have
or
those.
just tutoring programs or guidance programs, or just programs to help you get through school successfully, period, and to feel confident and comfortable, to give you goals in terms of what types of careers you want to have. There's also things like discriminatory factors that happen within schools.
Well, we're going to talk about those in a moment, but I also want to
issues.
talk about employment and business ownership. So we're going to have that conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Mindy Romero, who leads the California Civic Engagement Project at USC's Price School of Public Policy and is the recent author of a report entitled The State of Latino Economic Well-Being in California that was done in collaboration with the California Latino Economic Institute. So I want to ask you about your report on the workforce as it relates to Latinos. You say that Latinos make up 35% of the above 16 population, but 37% of the workforce, so higher representation there. The numbers are even higher in the San Joaquin Valley, where they make up 50% of the workforce, as compared to the Bay Area, where it's just 22%. So what are the types of jobs and occupations that Latinos are employed in?
That's an important question, because at least statewide, a quarter of Latinos that are employed in service occupations. Latinos are more likely to be employed in occupations that produce lower wages, period.
So let's talk about STEM jobs. That's science. Now I'm going to get it wrong. Science, technology, something in math. So
engineering.
Engineering. There you go. I should know that. My daughter's interested in engineering. Anyway, so those jobs, Latinos aren't really well represented there, are they?
No, 12% of the STEM jobs in California, or 12% of jobs in California are STEM, but only about 4%, a little over that, of jobs held by Latinos are in the STEM occupations.
So, smaller representation.
And if you take out healthcare, if you take those jobs out as part of the definition of STEM, it goes much lower.
And there are a lot of women involved, Latinas involved in healthcare, and then also flips the narrative on gender differences between Latino men and Latinas. Then all of a sudden you see more Latino men are in these STEM jobs because they're in engineering, things like that, where typically Latinas are not.
Exactly.
Okay.
With the broader definitions, it's a little bit more Latina than Latino, and then if you flip it, the numbers go way down.
But the bottom line
around
is
2%, and it's men are.
The bottom line is the
frequent.
numbers is quite low compared to the state average, and those were some of the jobs of the future and high-paying jobs. What about Latino entrepreneurs?
So when we're talking about business, Latinos there are underrepresented. So Latinos are about 24% of all the business owners in California, but they make up only about 6% of actually the sales and receipts.
So that sounds telling me small business. These are small.
They're much more likely to small businesses, but specifically businesses without employees, to be sole proprietorships, right? And they are producing at much lower rates than other businesses are.
So typically when you think of entrepreneurs, you're thinking high tech, but that's not always the case. There's a lot of entrepreneurs that are in these small businesses. Latinos, I think you said in your report, there are more of them that are entrepreneurs don't have a high school education, or they have high school education or less, as compared to a lot of other entrepreneurs in California.
Exactly, and that's also, at least in part, driven by the fact that they're more likely to be foreign-born. So there are some really positive numbers around entrepreneurship for Latinos. There's been a great deal of growth in the last few years, particularly for Latinos opening up their own businesses or starting some sort of business. The problem is that we've seen this growth, but still, again, much more likely to be no employees, much more likely to be small revenue producing. And when we think often the narrative around entrepreneurship or business ownership is one to say that it's positive, it's a way to get to the middle class or better. It's a pathway, an alternative pathway that will lead to a better quality of life for Latinos. But there is some speculation, some possibility that for many Latinos entering into business ownership could be a pathway that they're kind of forced into because they have fewer options in the labor market.
Right.
And then without the capital investment, without the training, the mentorship programs that often are hard to come by for the Latino community, they enter into a business and then it's not performing, or at least it's more of a challenge to perform at a high level.
And there are a lot of businesses that start that don't succeed, so that's an issue, obviously. Well, up next, we're going to talk about some of the geographic hotspots of Latino economic opportunity in the Valley. Where are they and what are the challenges? This is Mark Keppler with the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Mindy Romero with USC's Price School of Public Policy. Has done a report entitled The State of Latino Economic Wellbeing in California with the California Latino Economic Institute. You've got something in this report called a Latino Economic Index. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, I think it's probably the first of its kind in the nation that focuses solely on the Latino community and outcomes. We take about 30 or so, start with 30 or so indicators in the areas of education, tech and entrepreneurship, housing, income distribution, narrow that down into a subset, create an index that produces a score by all the way down to the community level. And we can score and identify how communities are doing, how Latinos in one community are faring versus Latinos in another.
So let's talk about that for a second. So you looked at different regions, 7 regions, I think you looked at.
7 regions and within those regions.
So let's talk about the San Joaquin Valley regions because that's what our audience is interested in. We had a score of 0.39, which is the 3rd lowest of the California regions you looked at. But as we take a closer look at the San Joaquin Valley really is trifurcated, right? There's kind of a north valley, there's a central part of the valley, and there's a south part. So let's start with the north part of the valley. Towns in San Joaquin, Merced, Stanislaus, and Mariposa counties, like Stockton, Modesto, Chowchilla, Corcoran, Merced. How did they fare?
So I'll just take it by community. So like Madera and Chowchilla were on the low end, right? So communities that are hotspots for poor performance, meaning that they're struggling in terms of their outcomes along all those measures that I just mentioned.
By the way, I took a close look at it. You had actually listed the top 10 best and top 10 worst. And
well, in terms of scores, we won't say worst or best.
In terms of scores, yes. Numerically, it's a math thing. But the North Valley had 5 of the towns, at least 5 of the towns in the bottom 10.
Yes.
Bottom 10 scores. So that was kind of surprising. I think, by the way, Newman had the worst score, had an LEI score of 0.26. Chowchilla and Corcoran were tied for 2nd worst. Patterson 9th worst, Merced 10th worst, was kind of surprising. So let me ask you this.
You read the report.
Oh, I did.
Thoroughly. I love it.
So let's talk about the central part of the San Joaquin Valley. So towns in Madera, Fresno, Kings, and Tulare County. How did they fare?
So Madera challenges as well.
I think they were sixth worst in the rankings.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
but you had some good towns too. You had, in fact, actually, what you found was Clovis and Old Fig Garden, as part, was kind of part of Fresno, did very well. Clovis was ranked third best, and Old Fig Garden was ranked seventh best. And it kind of ties into what you were saying in your study about, there's these very big differences between the kind of urban centers and the suburban places around the urban centers.
Well, I was going to say, we actually highlighted in the report that the Fresno area is a really great example of that, or an example of that, where the density of the Fresno area, really, if you zoom in, because we have these all visualized, right, by interactive maps, you can see this patchwork quilt, where the area as a whole is not doing very well, but you have communities like Clovis that are scoring some of the best in the whole valley, and other communities that are scoring very, very low.
The further you move out, the more you see that.
Yeah,
out to the rural areas.
So the urban cores, like Stockton, Modesto, Fresno, and so forth, we often see that patchwork quilt where communities right next door to each other have very different,
very different.
very different set of outcomes, very different realities.
Well, let's talk about the south part of the valley, kind of Kern County, basically. How did they do? Bakersfield, Tehachapi, California City, places like that. It seemed when I was looking at your report, it looked like there was kind of a bifurcation. I mean, he's doing pretty well. They had a number of ones that were scored. Rosedale was number one. California City was number 5. Bakersfield and Tehachapi tied Visalia for 7th. So pretty well. But then there's Pixley and Woodlake, who are the 4th worst. So kind of a bifurcation here.
I would say so. The other thing to think about is we're scoring Latino communities, right, with Latino communities. So this is the hotspots of challenge and the hotspots of opportunity for the Latino community. But you'll often see that the areas where Latinos are not, by and large, not doing as well, are the areas that have larger Latino populations, or at least down to the community place level. And the areas where Latinos are faring better or really high tend to be areas there might be a larger population center, but the Latino population is smaller in that community.
Well, I think your report is going to give some great information to policymakers in determining how can we improve the situation for Latinos in California. I want to thank Dr. Mindy Romero with the California Civic Engagement Project at USC's Price School of Public Policy for joining us. And thank you for joining us. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. See you next week.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.